By the time the valley exhaled, Stormfire was already a legend. It began before sunrise, when the air was still and the frost clung silver to the grass. The Hale ranch sat quiet, smoke from the chimney curling lazy into the pale light. Jonas Hale stepped out of his cabin, mug of coffee in hand, and stretched his back with the weary stiffness of a man accustomed to solitude. For 20 years he had risen this way, to the same horizon, the same silence. He had expected the morning to be no different, but silence can break like glass. From the north, paddock came a sound sharp as a rifle cracked the splinter of cedar posts under unbearable force. Jonas froze, the mug slipping from his grasp and scattering hot liquid onto the frozen dirt. He knew before he turned what had happened. His heart lurched against his ribs. Stormfire had broken free. The great stallion exploded through the fence in a spray of wood and wire, black body gleaming, mane streaked with silver that caught the sun like sparks. Dust rose behind him in thick clouds as he thundered into the open valley. Chickens shrieked. Dogs gave chase and fell back. Cattle surged against their pens in panic. Stormfire screamed his fury, a sound that rattled windows and set every creature trembling. Within moments, the valley was alive with chaos. Men came running, ropes in hand, shouting orders that fell useless against the roar of hooves. Caleb Turner, broad as an ox, barked commands to his sons. "Cut him off! Don't let him pass!" But the stallion was no ordinary horse. The first lasso missed. The second landed, bit tight for an instant, then slid free as though the animal wore armor. Stormfire shook his massive neck, ripped the rope loose, and bolted straight through the line of men. 2 of them went down in the dirt. Women clutched children to their skirts, dragging them toward the safety of cabins. Old Mrs. Whitfield stood in her doorway, wringing her hands until Stormfire plowed through her beloved garden, scattering roses and stones she had tended for years. She screamed at the heavens, at her husband, at Jonas Hale. Jonas ran, legs pumping, lungs burning. He had no plan but to get close, to try, though deep down he knew he had no strength for this. Stormfire was nearly 2,000 pounds of fury. Jonas had always known he was not a man made for contests of muscle. But he ran anyway until his stomach dropped. Young Tommy Turner had strayed too close. The boy stumbled, caught in the churned earth, and fell face first in the dirt. Stormfire's head snapped toward him, ears flat, eyes wild. He dropped into a crouch, gathering to strike. Jonas shouted the boy's name, voice tearing in his throat. He sprinted with everything he had, but the ground stretched cruelly long. He would never reach the child in time. And then she was there, Clara Boone, a blur of skirts and boots, taller than half the men in the valley, shoulders square, stride unhesitating. She vaulted the fence like a seasoned hand, landed lightly in the churned soil, and walked straight into the stallion's rage. Clara. Silas Ward, the merchant who had brought her wagon just yesterday, shouted in horror. But she didn't pause, hands open, palms lifted, voice low and firm. "Easy now. You're not angry. Just frightened. It's the wrong fence. The wrong morning. That's all." Stormfire's scream split the valley. He pawed the ground, dust spraying like smoke. The crowd held its breath. One wrong move, and the woman would be crushed. But Clara stepped closer, calm, deliberate, breath for breath. She matched him. His ears twitched, his nostrils flared. She raised a hand not to grab, not to strike, simply to offer. Her fingers brushed the base of his neck, slid into the groove behind his ear. Stormfire quivered, rocked back, then sagged as though the storm inside him had been drained away. His massive head lowered into her palm, hot breath gusting against her wrist. Gasps rolled through the valley. Within minutes, the impossible had become ordinary before their eyes. Clara looped a rope simple as a handshake. The stallion followed her steps, docile as a lamb. And then, astonishing all, she swung onto his back barehanded. Stormfire crow-hopped once, twice. But Clara sat deep, steady as an oak. "Easy," she murmured. And the beast eased. The valley exhaled as one. Mrs. Whitfield, her garden destroyed, stood speechless. Caleb Turner dropped his rope. Silas Ward clutched his hat, and Jonas Hale, chest-heaving, could only stare at the woman who, in one morning, had changed everything. 3 months. Earlier, 3 months before the miracle, Jonas sat alone at his cabin table, pencil trembling in hand. The lamplight flickered across the page as he scrawled the words that seemed both pitiful and desperate. Honest rancher seeks companion for frontier life. Must value simple pleasures and quiet evenings. He imagined a gentle woman, small and soft-spoken, hands tending his garden, voice filling his silence. Weeks passed. Then one envelope arrived, script careful and neat. Clara Boone. Her words spoke of loneliness that matched his own, of nights when the wind rattled lonely windows, of longing not for noise but for someone to share the quiet. Jonas read the letter until it frayed. He kept it beneath his pillow. From an oak branch fallen in last winter's storm, he carved a ring. Each night he sanded, polished, smoothed. Hours bent over the small thing. His hope poured into its grain. When Silas Ward's wagon finally rattled into his yard, Jonas fingered the ring in his pocket, his chest hammering with anticipation. He pictured delicate fingers slipping it on, but when the dust settled, he craned his neck upward at a woman 6 feet tall, shoulders broad, hands calloused. Clara Boone. From that moment, his life veered off its imagined path, onto a road he could never have drawn. Part 2. First meetings and the days that followed. The miracle had not finished echoing off the cottonwoods before the valley began to repack the story in boxes that fit their hands. By noon, there were already 2 versions circulating from porch to porch. In one, Clara Boone had charmed the devil out of a demon horse with a witch's whisper. In the other, she had stared the beast down so hard his knees gave way out of respect. Both traveled fast. Neither was much like the truth, which was quieter and more difficult to perform on command. Clara and Jonas spent the late morning walking Stormfire back to the corral at a pace that would not insult his nerves. The stallion moved with the overly careful steps of something remembering what it had just decided not to do. The rope hung slack. Clara didn't look triumphant. She looked like someone wiped clean by weather. "North post's ruined," she said at last. "I've got cedar lengths in the shed." Jonas hated how thin his voice sounded beside hers. He cleared it and tried again. "Seasoned since spring." "Good," she said. "We'll sink them deep, lean the brace toward the wind, give him no easy picture of escape next time." Next time. The words scraped Jonas's chest in a way that wasn't entirely pain. They sounded like partnership. The small good shock of hearing we when you are used to I. A trickle of neighbors found excuses to pass the Hale place that day. A woman from the far end of the lane brought a pie to celebrate the Lord's mercies. 2 boys came looking for a lost hoop and left circling back over their shoulder for another look at the tall woman with the dust still in her hair. Mrs. Whitfield arrived to announce she was not angry about the roses. Truly she was not, just disappointed in the universe's taste. And did Clara happen to know whether delphiniums could be persuaded to forgive? Clara took it all with a calm that made the visits end before they began. She didn't perform modesty, and she didn't perform pride. She nodded at what was reasonable, added a thought when it would help, and declined with a kind smile when the conversation reached for something that wasn't hers to hand over. Caleb Turner waited until the sun slanted and the day's heat softened. He appeared with his 3 sons arrayed behind him like a fence line. Ben, squared jaw. Luke, broad shoulders. Tommy, still white around the mouth from the morning. Caleb's hat was tipped back and his thumbs were hooked in his belt, with the casualness of a man who had practiced looking casual. "Fence to set?" he said, as though he hadn't already counted the broken posts from the road. "We brought tools." Jonas tensed. Pride and gratitude were 2 horses yoked to opposing carts, and both wanted him to climb up. "Thank you," he managed. Clara lifted the new post as the men arrived. She didn't heft it to show anything off. She just picked it up the way she would lift a thought worth having and set it where it needed to go. She tested the hole Jonas had dug depth. True. Tamp then nodded once and raised the post. Ben Turner put a hand out with the reflex of a man raised to believe his hands should go everywhere first. "I've got it," Clara said, pleasant and definite as a fence law. Ben colored. Luke found something fascinating to stare at in his boot heel. Tommy kept his gaze fixed on Clara with a mixture of awe and the simmering embarrassment of someone who had nearly been crushed and been rescued by someone unexpected. Caleb leaned his weight into silence. "Hale," he said after a while, "you always set your brace like that?" Jonas considered the question and the man. Turner's tone said test. The question itself said he'd done enough fence to know there were 2 answers that would work and 100 that would fail after the first hard wind. Usually, Jonas said. But the ground's different here. Clay under the topsoil. If you lean the brace out, the frost heave will push it loose by January. Caleb grunted the small grunt of a man who will not grant you the courtesy of surprise but finds himself surprised anyway. Huh. They set 3 posts in a row and ran fresh wire. Of the 10 hands in the yard, Clara's were the only ones that never fumbled. That could have stung, and perhaps it did in ways Jonas would have trouble naming, but the work fit in around the sting and softened it. He discovered, to his own surprise, that he liked explaining what he knew without the usual scramble to provide proof. He liked that she listened the way a person listens who intends to use what she's given. She asked questions meant to get at why. He answered with what. Between them, the fence got fixed. When they were finished, Clara stood with her hands on the top rail and squinted along the line, not for compliments from men but for the place a wind would find weakness. "We'll check it tomorrow," she said. Fences tell their secrets after a night's rest. The Turners left in a knot of muttered opinions. Only Tommy lingered, boots shuffling, hat in hands he couldn't seem to remember where to put. He looked from the corral to Clara to Jonas and then finally dared. "Ma'am, if you hadn't—" "I mean thank you." Clara tipped her head in a way that refused ownership of gratitude and returned it to the boy's own feet. "You're welcome. Next time you see a horse taking the world apart, don't stand in the picture he's drawing." Tommy flushed, grinned despite himself, and ran to catch his family. When the shadows stretched long, Jonas carried a bucket to the pump and worked the handle until the cool water rose and spilled. He cupped a drink with his hands, let it run down his wrists, and felt his heart slow. "You saved him," he said. The words dropped between them like coins that refused to clink. "You saved Tommy, and you saved us from being a story that ends differently." Clara shrugged one shoulder. On another person it would have been a small gesture, but on her frame it suggested a ship shifting anchor. "I've seen worse end other ways. Luck counts. So does meeting a creature where its fear lives." The remark didn't feel like boasting. It was weather talk. If you lived in a place where weather sometimes arrived on 4 legs. "I don't know that language," Jonas admitted. "Whatever you spoke." "You do," she said, and something in her voice turned the line from comfort to fact. "You speak it to the garden, to your tools, to the hours you make do. A horse just happens to be louder when he answers." He wanted to tell her then about the ad and the carving and the ring that would not fit. He didn't. Words thinned and snagged on shame too easily when he tried to drag them into daylight. He carried the bucket instead, set it by the door, and thought about all the parts of himself that might be worth learning a new grammar for. They made a small supper, because small had always been Jonas's measure of enough. The silence between them took a new shape, no longer the emptiness that expands until it crowds a room, but the kind that sits down and keeps you company. When the meal was over, Clara stood, stacked the plates, and said, "Where do you keep the lamp oil?" "This wick's dying on a short life." He showed her. She fixed it. She did not comment on the amount of soot on the glass, or on the fact that most of his life had been lived in the half-light without complaint. The second day arrived, and with it the 2 velocities of gossip, the sort that wanted to cut them small and the sort that wanted to enlarge the miracle until it burst. Jonas recognized both, having been whittled and inflated by other people's words for most of his adulthood. He suffered the first because he had practice. He suffered the second because no one survives long being called legendary at breakfast and less than a man by lunch. Clara went to town with him for flour and wire staples and the other small needs that make a life stay put. At Ward's General, Mrs. Whitfield squinted at Clara's height as though it were a new kind of sin that needed a price. Silas Ward, for his part, looked like a man trying to decide whether to take credit for something or make himself small enough not to be asked. Clara ignored both and asked practical questions about the cost of oiled leather and whether Ward had any linseed left that hadn't gone turned. When a sack split on the counter and floured her skirt white, she brushed it off with an expression a breath shy of a smile. "I've seen worse," she said. "What's worse than flour?" Silas asked, pained by the loss of inventory. 10 pounds of nails, she said. "On your foot." Silas winced and charged her 2 cents less for the staples. Out on the boardwalk, A boy dared his friend to walk under Clara's shadow. Another child announced that if he were a horse, he would let her ride him too. Jonas choked on his own breath and was surprised to hear Clara laugh, a small, low sound like the river when it's not in a hurry. Evening settled into a pattern that did not feel like a trap. Jonas cut wood and mended, the long work of a place that will fall apart if you forget it once. Clara stitched and read and sometimes carved small shapes with his spare knife, her big hands careful, her attention soft. On the third night, she handed him a wooden bird whittled from scrap. "It won't fly, but it could sit and look like it might," she said. "It's better than that," he said honestly. "It knows how to wait." He set it on the window frame, where morning would find it and not be alone. On the fifth day, Caleb Turner returned to the fence line with the look of a man who had something to say about order. He studied the new posts, gave a grudging nod to the brace that would not heave, and then turned to Jonas with a face arranged for politeness that could be unscrewed into insult in 2 words. "You've got what you wanted," he said. "A woman that can take a wild animal by the head and ask it to please behave. Let's hope the rest of your life keeps up." Jonas's ears flamed. But before he could construct a reply both accurate and survivable, Clara spoke. "The rest of his life already keeps up," she said. "It built this place while you were measuring it." Caleb blinked, not because the sentence was sharp, though it was, but because it landed where he hadn't been looking. For a moment the two of them stood there, the man used to throwing strength at problems until they broke, and the woman who had ridden strength into listening. Caleb lifted a shoulder. "Well," he said, as men say when a conversation has taken a turn they did not authorize, "as long as the fence holds." "It will," Jonas said. And for the first time in days, the words felt like they could balance their own weight. They walked the fence at dusk and found the long, slow secrets fences tell. A staple that would like a hammer's kiss. A run of wire that had ideas about slack. A post that wanted one more tamp. They did the work. Somewhere a nightbird started up. Stormfire blew out a long breath and tucked a hind leg under the big dark of his body. "Tomorrow," Clara said, "we ought to check the north corner for a soft spot in the earth where water sits after rain. That's where posts dream of falling over. I didn't see standing water. You won't, not in this stretch of dry. But the memory of it lives where the ground goes differently green. You look for the recollection, not the fact." Jonas nodded like a man who understood everything, and discovered he did. The lesson wasn't about fence. It was about how to look at what is and imagine what it has been carrying. That night he took the ring out again. He turned it in his fingers, saw the places he had sanded thin, the tiny flaw like a crescent moon near the grain. He measured it against his own smallest finger and thought of hers and smiled at the foolishness that had once been hope and the hope that had once been foolish. He slipped it back into his pocket and told himself there would be a time when the small was not an insult. The valley slept. The valley did not. Both things felt true, and Jonas found for the first time that truth at this scale did not frighten him. Part 3. The Trial of Water and Light. Summer rolled forward with its usual stubbornness. Days that burned the tools hot, nights that cooled enough to make the bed sheets feel like forgiveness. The fence held. The garden lifted its head. The talk grew less bright gossip dulls if you do not feed it, and more useful. There were seeds to trade, and eggs to barter. And once, a patch of shingles to be found for a cabin roof prone to weeping in a hard rain. Stormfire adjusted to the boundaries of his new map, as creatures do when the map is not an insult. He watched the world over the fence and learned its habits. The hens were foolish. The cows were dull but unthreatening. The wind had more to say in the evenings than the mornings. The tall woman meant what she said. The smaller man did too. But he needed to say it twice, to the barn, to the tool, to himself, before the words sat down. Caleb Turner kept a careful distance, which was not the same as leaving them alone. His boys came by to ask for advice about calves with the runs and left trying not to look impressed that Jonas knew the slow medicine of patience and boiled water. One afternoon, Ben Turner cracked a joke about Jonas's hands being better fit for needles than hammers, and looked surprised when Jonas laughed first and loudest. "You're not wrong," Jonas said, and showed them how to mend a split hoof with a strip of leather and time. "Some problems you can't beat into shape. You have to sit beside them until they decide better." Luke blinked. Ben looked at Clara, who was standing 2 yards away with her arms folded, and an expression that suggested she would like to have this sentence engraved on something permanent. It was a nearly perfect evening when the sky shifted. The east darkened. The wind went sideways and sour with the smell of distant rain. Jonas looked up. Clara did too. Weather has a way of turning two people into the same person for a second or two, if they are watching it arrive honestly. Flash flood if it hits the pass, Jonas said. He felt it in his knee, and in the little pulse that lives under the tongue when you know you are about to be called out of your regular life. The low swale by Whitfield's garden will fill first, Clara said. She built pretty where water wants to rest. They moved before the first drop. Tools were gathered, animals settled to higher ground. Jonas jogged to the Turners to offer a hand because you do that when a thing is bigger than your fence. Clara saddled Stormfire for the first time since the day of the miracle. He took the bit with the dignity of a creature who has decided to dignify you. The rain arrived like a decision. It didn't pour. It descended. In minutes, the middles of the lanes were streams. The swale by the Whitfields became a pond, then a lake. Jonas waded to the porch to pound on the door. Mr. Whitfield opened it with a face arranged for denial until the water lapped his boot sole. "Out," Jonas said. "Now." Mrs. Whitfield gathered her photo albums, the old wooden box and the newer tin, and her mouth pinched so tight it might have cut string. Jonas took the heavier box without commentary. There were things to save, and the list is seldom reasonable when the water is rising. Clara came through the gray like a larger fact. Stormfire surged under her as if the day were trying to push him back, and he had decided not to be pushed. She reined to the porch, reached and lifted the tin box with her free hand, then yelled over the noise. "Caleb's creek has jumped its bed. He needs hands at the north ford. There's a yearling caught in the fence line where the water's taken it under." "I'll go," Jonas said. "I'll go," Mrs. Whitfield said, and then looked at her dress with disbelief. "I'll number. You go." Jonas set the box down inside the door and ran. The north ford was a throat of brown water. Logs spun. Fences leaned like tired men. Caleb Turner was midstream with a rope around his waist, braced by his sons on the bank. "The fence has a calf," he roared, voice ripped into scraps by the wind. "She's tangled." Jonas reached the post where the rope tied off and tested it. "You'll get pulled under," he shouted back. "Bring her to the cut." He pointed to a place where the bank bit sharp into the flow and the current curled. Caleb scowled, the look of a man insulted by geometry telling him what to do. Then the calf bawled a terrible, ripped sound, and his scowl turned to the face of a father with no time left for pride. "Hold!" he yelled to his boys. "Ben, Luke!" They leaned their weight into the rope, shoes sliding. Caleb took 3 staggering steps toward the curl Jonas had indicated, and felt the river shift from enemy to collaborator. The calf swung into the eddy, head up, eyes wild. Jonas waded to his waist, grabbed the wire where it cut the animal's flank, and worked the staple loose with gentle speed that felt like prayer. "Knife," he said, and Ben had one in his palm by the time the word ended. Jonas cut a strand, then another, each motion careful as stitches. The calf's breaths came in panic jerks. Jonas kept his own even and stupidly slow, as if the river might take a hint. The wire gave. The calf lurched. Caleb hauled. The boys anchored. The water tried one last time to make everybody ridiculous and then, disgusted, let them climb out. They did the farmer's thing then. Hands on knees, heads down, breath hauled in. Curses that are really blessings muttered to no one in particular. Jonas felt a hand on his shoulder and looked up to find Caleb's face too close and too honest for the old dance. "Good call," Caleb said. "Good pull," Jonas said. The rain kept coming, but now it was ordinary rain. The awful had taken its bite and moved on. Clara rode down out of the gray. She was soaked head to boot, hair slicked to her skull, Stormfire blowing like a black pump. "There's a gap at Hale's lower fence," she yelled. "If we don't set a stop, the heifers will think the world is larger than it is, and we'll spend next week apologizing across county lines." Jonas laughed in a way that surprised himself. It burst up from somewhere warm and old. "Let's tell them the story's the same size as yesterday then." They worked another hour to make that true. Stormfire planted his feet in the sucking mud and leaned his weight where Clara asked. Jonas set poles like punctuation where the water needed sentences. Caleb arrived with a load of boards no one had asked him for but everyone required. The valley, which had arrived earlier in judgment to watch the show of a miracle, now arrived at the far more ordinary miracle of neighbors, working until their breath turned into steam, and their hands forgot which body they belonged to. At last the rain settled into sleep. The Ford returned to a mutter. The calf, wrapped in a sack against the chill, fell into the boneless slumber of the recently terrified. They trudged back to the Hale porch in a silence that felt earned. Clara swung down from Stormfire with a stiffness she did not announce. Jonas handed her a towel that had been clean once this week, and thought about how many times offering a small thing to a person you admire is the bravest thing you can do. Caleb stood a long moment in the yard as if uncertain of the etiquette for gratitude. Then he lifted a hand in a clumsy half-salute and went home. Clara sat on the step and wrung water from her skirt. "What you did at the Ford," she said without looking up. "That wasn't luck. It was knowing how this land thinks when it's angry. I talked to it," Jonas said, "when no one's listening." He waited for mockery. None arrived. "Then you'll do," she said. "A place likes to be heard." She worked a knot of hair loose. "So does a horse. So does a person?" he asked before he could be wise. Her mouth tilted. "Sometimes," she said. "If the listener is the right one." That night, when the lamps were out and the day was stored where memories keep the light from leaking, Jonas took the ring from his pocket again. He set it on the table and looked at it the way a man looks at maps. It was too small. It had always been too small. But the story it promised was not. He placed his finger through to the place it would stop on Clara's and knew, in the little ache of the gap, that growth can be measure and vow both. Stormfire shifted in the corral and blew a long, content breath across the night. The valley, for once, slept both the truth and the lie at the same time, and was not punished for it. Part 4. The porch, the ring, and the wedding. The evening after the flood smelled of wet wood and cooled iron. The stars came out late, shy at first, then bold as if the sky had remembered itself. Jonas and Clara sat on the porch in the way they had learned. He in the creaking chair that had been his companion longer than anyone, she on the top step with one knee bent and the other leg long, a posture that refused apology for the space it took. They watched the world return to its regular shapes. Frogs tried out their voices in the low places. Somewhere a dog barked once to see if it still could. Stormfire stood with one hip dropped, a silhouette as extravagant as anything God had ever carved from an evening. "This isn't what you expected," Clara said at last, softly. "No," Jonas said. He did not try to make the word better than it was. "I imagined someone smaller. Someone who'd need me in the ways I had imagined being needed. And I imagined," she said, "someone who wouldn't measure me at all by what cannot be put away." They let that sit. It did not rock. It held steady like a good post set deeper than the ground told you at first. Jonas reached inside his vest and brought out the little wooden box. The hinge squeaked a sound that will always remind a man of promises, even if he is not making one. He opened it, and the ring lay there. Oak, sanded smooth, polished with oil and waiting. "I started this the day your first letter came," he said. "I thought—" He laughed in a way that did not open him to ridicule because he was already open. "I thought your hand would be like the picture I carried around to keep my courage." "It is not," she said with kindness. "Number." He smiled at his own foolishness. "But I would like my courage to be about the truth." He took the ring out and set it in her palm. It looked small there. Everything would, and some things should. She slid it onto her finger and it stopped where it had always been bound to stop. At the second knuckle, halfway between intent and arrival. She turned her hand so the starlight could find the grain. "You spent 3 months making something beautiful for a woman you had never met," she said. "That says more about the maker than the measurements." "I want to ask you," he said. "Properly. Not because a paper needs signing or a town needs a story that ends the way they prefer." She closed his fingers gently around the ring and then put both her hands over his. Her hands were warm, nicked in 3 places by a day that had asked for too much, strong in a way that made strength seem like another word for steadiness. "Ask me, Jonas Hale," she said. "Ask me as if you have decided to build a thing neither of us can carry alone." He had practiced a sentence once that sounded fine in the mouth until you heard it in the world and realized it had no place to sit. What came now had been hammered into shape by weather. "Clara Boone," he said, "will you marry me? Not to rescue either of us from being alone. To be the person I listen to first and the person I answer last. To carry the fence posts I cannot lift, and let me carry the questions you cannot set down. To make this place larger in the ways that do not require land. Yes, she said. And her yes didn't ring like a bell. It landed like a tool in a hand that had been empty too long. Then she lifted one finger as if counting something old and precious. With conditions, he grinned. Name them. We resize this ring together. I'll learn your patience with wood. You'll learn my language for horses. When the world divides, we will build a bridge out of what each of us knows. He had never loved a sentence more. All of it, he said. They set about the resizing the way a pair sets about anything worth doing. They measured. They talked about grain and where it wants to split. They argued once, lightly, about whether linseed was better than tallow for bringing out a shine, and discovered the pleasure in being wrong when the right answer sits between you. Jonas cut a thin, perfect crescent from a second piece of oak and fitted it so clean the seam disappeared under his thumb. Clara sanded with slow circles that could have polished a memory. When it was done, they both held their breath like children, and then laughed at themselves because the ring did not require breath to do what a ring does. It slipped home on her hand with the quiet relief of something finding its place. Again, Clara said, and Jonas understood without asking that she meant the words and the ceremony and the thing that would make both real to anyone who could not see the truth without a witness. They walked to the church on a Saturday in October, when the cottonwoods had thrown gold everywhere as if the valley might forget color and needed reminding. The preacher had a voice that liked to be heard. On most days, Jonas disliked it on principle. On this day, he found himself grateful that someone else could lift the words higher and let them fall back whole. The neighbors came in their better shirts and their practiced expressions. Mrs. Whitfield wore a hat with a flower on it that insisted on being yellow even in the face of everything. Silas Ward stood near the back with the proud slump of a man who would like to pretend he had played a larger role than he had but is content to have been present. Caleb Turner arrived late on purpose and took a position that seemed accidental and was not. Clara wore a dress that did not try to make her smaller. Jonas wore a suit that had belonged to his father and fit a little better than memory because he had let his life make him into it. The ring slid where it should. The matched band she had carved for him walnut, dark as the creek under shade, settled on his hand with a gravity that would keep him anchored in high winds. The vows were simple because simple words hold better. We will listen. We will ask. We will brace the post toward the wind that is actually coming, not the one we prefer. We will make each other larger in the only ways that matter. We will be wrong and say so. Do you? Said the preacher. I do, said Jonas, and heard in his own mouth the sound a man makes when he recognizes his house from the road. I do, said Clara, and heard in hers the sound a door makes when it opens and someone you love walks through carrying both hands full of what you needed. When they stepped out into the yard, the wind put a hand through the cottonwoods and made them applaud. The horse stood at the fence line, ears forward, eyes soft, as if he understood marriage in a way that would embarrass the preacher. Mrs. Whitfield dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief and pretended it was for the last of the delphiniums. Caleb Turner tipped his hat, not to surrender but to respect. Tommy Turner crowed the way boys do when a thing ends well and they need the world to know they were present. The feast that followed was the ordinary raucous of good bread and tables steady under the weight of other people's best. Someone had roasted a pig. Someone else had brought a pie that leaned toward disaster and then decided to be perfect instead. Silas Ward tried to make a toast and ended up telling a story about how he once sold 3 pounds of nails to a man who actually needed 2 pounds of patience. And everyone laughed because that's how it works here. Jonas took Clara's hand under the table when no one else was looking and found it fit his like a handle you had used so many times you no longer thought about how to lift it. What do we do tomorrow? He asked. Because tomorrow is the test and the reward of a good day. Fix the small leak in the barn roof, she said, and teach you how to ask Stormfire for his shoulder without a fight. She squeezed his fingers. And you can teach me how to listen to your garden without getting bossed around by it. And if there's time, we'll sit. Sit, he said, tasting the word the way a man tastes the first strawberry of June. I'd like to. He liked all of it. In the weeks that followed, the valley learned to tell the story a better way. They still liked the miracle. Who wouldn't? But they began to set the miracle down inside the larger, quieter fact that a woman and a man had built something with 2 kinds of strength and the same kind of respect, and that it had held under weather and would hold again. Stormfire learned a trick Clara did not teach him, and Jonas did. To come when called, not because the hand held a halter, but because the voice had never lied. Jonas learned a trick Clara did not announce and everyone knew: to enter a room already his size. They both learned that the hardest fences are the ones inside your own jaw, and they set their braces accordingly. When winter came, it came honestly, with a clean edge and no apologies. The North Post held. The wind threw itself against the world and found fewer things it could knock over. The creek learned the habit of restraint. Mrs. Whitfield planted delphiniums in the spring in a place no horse could reach without an argument with God. People forget the particulars of a miracle if you let enough time across the road. What they do not forget is the sight of two people walking shoulder to shoulder the long way around, and not once measuring their strides for advantage. Years later, when a child asked his mother if the story about the woman who tamed the black horse was true, she said, "Probably, but what's certainly true is that she kept him, and he kept her, and the man beside them kept the line straight. If there is a moral, and the valley liked morals, even when it pretended otherwise, it is only this: strength wears more faces than a census can count, and the only way to miss them all is to insist you already know what they look like." Jonas Hale did not. Clara Boone never did. Between them, they learned a language no one else had bothered with and taught it to a place that had been waiting to speak back. On a morning years later, when the sun came up on frost and smoke and a fence line that still leaned toward the wind you actually get, Jonas stepped out with his coffee and found Clara in the corral with Stormfire's grandson. The colt eyed her the way creatures eye weather they cannot name. Clara lifted a hand. Jonas leaned on the rail and smiled and did not call this a miracle. He called it practice. He raised his cup toward her. She raised her palm toward him. The horse lowered its head into a future that had been carefully measured, sanded, oiled, and fit to size.